Kirby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. It is the Wednesday edition of Point of View, and we're going to spend some time this first hour talking about some of the problems that have surfaced over the years in churches and Christian ministries. Going to talk about scandals and fraud and those kinds of things, if for no other reason than that is in the news, and it is something that we do talk about from time to time. We'll primarily be looking at the issue of fraud, but if you go to the author that is an individual we're going to be talking about, Ministry Watch, we have a link there, and it certainly goes into a number of other issues, including the recent Southern Baptist Convention, in which they want to investigate many of the allegations there. We've had these kind of conversations before. We feel that they are important, number one, because, as we've said before, there's no issue off the table here at Point of View. And number two, as you will find out very quickly, you have to do your own research. Just because an organization says that they are transparent and following biblical principles, and maybe even just because they're a member of the Evangelical Council for Financial Accountability, ECFA, doesn't always necessarily mean everything is the way it should be. And so it is something that we wanted to help you as an investor, as a person giving to various ministries, think a little bit about. It's all tied around a book that Warren Cole Smith has been working on, came out recently, called Faith-Based Fraud, Learning from the Great Religious Scandals of Our Time. You may be familiar with Warren Cole Smith because he is the president of Ministry Watch, an organization that I depend on to find out more about what is happening with various organizations. He's had a quarter of a century working as a writer, editor, marketer. We've talked with him in the past because he's worked with the Colson Center for Christian Worldview and has had a 2-decade association with World Magazine, both as a writer and editor, even as the podcast host, and much, much more. You may have seen some of his other books, for example, A Lover's Quarrel with the Evangelical Church. And oftentimes when we talk about media bias, he and, of course, Marvin Olasky, Dr. Marvin Olasky, are the co-authors of the book Prodigal Press, Confronting the Anti-Christian Bias of the American News Media. Warren Cole Smith, welcome back to Point of View.
Thank you, Kirby. Great to be on with you. Appreciate it very much.
Let's, before we get into the various scandals, use kind of that first chapter of your book to kind of explain some things. The first is, as I just mentioned, ECFA. I think most of our listeners would understand what that is. Also, that Christian organizations need to file a Form 990. Since I head up different organizations, I've had to sign a few of those. Those of us in the state of Texas didn't have to actually file them till yesterday, although we filed one last month as well. And yet there are Christian organizations and churches that don't have to file that. And so as we go through this, there are going to be a couple of terms, and I appreciate the fact that near the back of your book you have a whole section on some of the terms, because you are used to it, I'm used to it, but some of our listeners maybe need to just get kind of a thumbnail sketch for how we can evaluate these Christian ministries and churches that we have been giving our donor dollars to. Can you help us out?
Yeah, exactly right. You mentioned a couple of terms, in one case an organization. I'll unpack briefly. The Evangelical Council for Financial Accountability has about 2,500 members. Many of the best-known organizations in the country, Compassion International, World Vision, the Billy Graham Evangelistic Association, Focus on the Family. A lot of the big evangelical ministries are a member of the ECFA, and they do good work. They set standards for financial integrity. I think that the ECFA has some limitations, and we can talk about that, Kirby, if you want to.
Sure.
But I do think that the 7 standards for financial integrity that the ECFA has identified is really excellent work and does kind of represent a good standard, a bar to which Christian ministry should aspire. You also mentioned the Form 990. That's, for lack of a better word, this is not precisely accurate, but it's like a tax return. It is a form that an organization that is tax exempt must file every year. In some ways, you might say that, if you're an organization that doesn't have to pay taxes, because you're doing some good for the public, that's great. I'm in favor of organizations not having to pay taxes that perform some sort of as public good. But the Form 990 ensures that you are actually doing that public good. It actually, has some financial disclosure on there, salaries of senior executives, where the money goes that comes into the organization, a list of the board of directors, that kind of information. They're vital documents to help us ensure transparency and accountability within the Christian ministry world. But if you're a church, you don't have to file a Form 990. That's called the church exemption.
Yes.
And there are a lot of nonprofit organizations that are not churches that are starting to take advantage of that church exemption. And we think that's a bad idea. And once again, Kirby, if you want to talk more about that, I'd be glad to.
Well, again, that's in the book. And boy, first of all, I would encourage people to get a copy of the book because it, especially if you're making investments into various organizations, that is the case. And we're going to delve into some of the scandals. But just to be fair, let's mention the fact that most of the organizations that are members, for example, the Evangelical Council for Financial Accountability, are good organizations worthy of your support. I was just thinking yesterday we had Ken Ham on, and I know there's a group called Wall Watchers, which in the past has, for example, designated my ministry, Pro Ministries, as a shining light organization. On a pretty routine basis, I've noticed that, for example, Answers in Genesis has been identified as a shining light organization. Paul Barak has been on the program with us and helped us with some of these Israel tours. His mission organization has been that. So that is sort of going above and beyond, giving transparency and accountability and the rest. But we're going to spend some time now talking about the other aspect of it. And since you mentioned churches, one of the things that you talk about early on in the book is we do have some celebrity pastors. And as much as I love to interview them, you have pointed out that some of them, not too many of the ones we've interviewed on this program, but some, because they are such celebrities and above any kind of accountability, you see that as a potential danger factor to think about as well in terms of supporting some of those churches and ministries, don't you?
I do. I think the church exemption is a good idea. If you're a local church and the vast majority of your funds come from your congregation, and the local congregation knows where the money's going because they're showing up for church every Sunday, and they elect leadership that are going over budgets and reviewing salaries, I think that it's appropriate for those types of organizations to have the church exemption. There's no reason that you or I, Kirby, need to look into the finances of a local church, in another part of the country, when that organization is not taking money from anybody other than the members of that church who are up close and personal there. But there are a lot, especially in this day and age, this is really kind of a recent phenomenon in the last 30 or 40 or 50 years, where you have mega churches that also have mega ministries.
Yes.
They have television ministries. They have radio ministries. They're taking money from all over the country and in some cases from all around the world, but they are still hiding behind that local church exemption. We say that's a problem. We think those churches should segregate their ministries and disclose their finances to the public.
We'll be right back.
This is Viewpoints with Kirby Anderson.
Yesterday, I talked about how even some liberal commentators are very concerned about the arguments for critical race theory, but it turns out that if you're a critic of critical race theory, you will be labeled as ignorant and racist. Tom Gilson addresses those changes in a recent commentary. He quotes from a Texas school board education member who writes that critics have no idea what critical race theory is, what it does, or who the founders are. They've never read a book, much less a paragraph on it. From there, she goes on to use language I won't use on radio or in this commentary. He also quotes from another article that argued that critics don't want to talk about racial disparities because they want to normalize the behavior and allow current patterns of behavior to continue. Tom Gilson says the words talk or talking show up 8 times in the article, but critical race theory isn't about just talking about racial disparities. He quotes from a standard source written 4 years ago and hardly the most controversial book on the subject. That book provides the quote I mentioned yesterday. It explains that critical race theory questions the very foundation foundations of the liberal order, including equality theory, legal reasoning, Enlightenment rationalism, and neutral principles of constitutional law. The book also argues that radical measures are in order because society is so racist. When it was written, the authors may not have meant radical involved riots, protest, and burning cities, but we have seen the natural result of arguing that America is systemically racist, full of white privilege, and in need of a social revolution to overturn the existing order. I agree with Tom Gilson. He concludes that the critics of critical race theory oppose it not from ignorance, but because they truly understand its dangers. I'm Kirby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you hear on Viewpoints by visiting pointofview.net. Pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Continue our conversation today with Warren Cole Smith. The book is entitled Faith-Based Fraud, 280 pages, 12 chapters. We won't have a chance to cover all of that. And as you might imagine, since we're talking about faith-based fraud, we will in just a minute be talking about Jim and Tammy Faye Baker and some of the televangelist scandal, one because it's one of the chapters in the book, but also because if you haven't noticed, there is a film coming out this fall called The Eyes of Tammy Faye. Andrew Garfield plays Jim Baker, Jessica Chastain plays Tammy Faye Baker. It's probably going to be pretty intense, but before we get to that, I want to commend you, Warren Cole Smith, for the fact that you have a chapter there on Charles Ponzi for a couple of reasons. First of all, anytime somebody disagrees with something, they call it a Ponzi scheme. I mean, I've heard people call any kind of marketing program a Ponzi scheme. If they don't like cryptocurrency, that's a Ponzi scheme. I've heard people say that the fiat currency we have is a Ponzi scheme. So it would be a great public service to talk about who Charles Ponzi is, and in some respects see how what he did in terms of kind of more of a secular world ended up surfacing many times in the Christian world. So give us a little bit of a background in Charles Ponzi and the idea of a Ponzi scheme.
Yeah, Charles Ponzi is one of the more remarkable stories in American history. It's got a little bit of everything, you know. It's a lot of flamboyance and money and kind of the celebrity status. But in a nutshell, Charles Ponzi was an immigrant to the United States, and he was a small man, 5 feet 2 inches tall, but he had massive dreams. He landed in Boston, Massachusetts in 1903 and was very intelligent. He quickly learned English, but he had kind of larceny in the heart. And he ended up he was stealing money. His early jobs were just working in a restaurant, becoming a waiter. But he was fired after his customers repeatedly complained that he shortchanged them. So even from the very beginning, Charles Ponzi was kind of a fraud and a flim-flam man, kind of trying to scam people. And he ended up getting involved in a couple of different frauds, but the one that he's the most known for is the big Ponzi scheme that involved this unusual financial instrument, you might say, Kirby. It's called an international reply coupon. In the early part of the 20th century, America was just kind of emerging on the global scene. And in an effort to encourage international business, the government would allow these international reply coupons to be purchased and put in in a letter that you might send to another country, so that if you wanted to ask for information, for example, about the services of an American company, the American company could respond without having to pay, exorbitant international postage. These international reply coupons would allow cost-effective international mail. Well, what Ponzi discovered was that you could purchase these international reply coupons in one country at one price, but sell them in America at another price and make a modest profit on it. And he said that, if I could do this in scale, that maybe I could make a lot of money. So he ended up getting a lot of people to invest in this scheme to buy these international reply coupons at one cost and sell them at another cost. The problem is he never actually went through with his idea. He just took the money. And he never bought these international reply coupons, but he had, because the scheme sounded like it might work, it attracted a lot of vulnerable people, and especially when Charles Ponzi started paying returns to the folks that invested early, that just created a frenzy. Well, the problem, though, is that Charles Ponzi was using the new investors to pay off the old investors.
Yes.
He wasn't even investing the money at all. He was living a very lavish lifestyle, communicating to the world that he was successful when he wasn't, in fact, successful at all. That became known as a Ponzi scheme, where you take money from new investors to pay the old investors. Of course, the problem with a Ponzi scheme is that it is inherently unsustainable. You eventually run out of new investors to invest in the scheme, and the whole thing falls apart. Ponzi ended up going to jail. Thousands of people ended up being defrauded of money. We've come to call that a Ponzi scheme, and we've seen it many, many times throughout the 20th and 21st centuries.
And again, to be fair, he was not necessarily doing this in the religious community, but this idea of affinity fraud and Ponzi scheme is kind of, if you will, a precursor to then, let's, if we can, talk about perhaps the most famous of the so-called televangelist scandals. You have a whole chapter on Jim and Tammy Faye Baker. For some of our listeners who were around during the 1980s, they would be familiar. For some of our younger listeners, maybe Generation Y and Generation Z, they'll be finding out about this maybe for the first time. Of course, as I pointed out, there's a movie coming out in the fall, and if they go and watch that, maybe you can set the record straight, because I got a feeling that film is not going to be terribly accurate in a few places. What are your thoughts?
Well, yeah, I've not seen the movie. I've only watched the trailer. I'm anxious to see the movie, but unfortunately, I think you may be right. I think that they're going to gloss over some probably important aspects of the Jim and Tammy Faye Baker scandal. But, I appreciate you asking, Kirby, about Charles Ponzi, because we see a lot of what happened in the original Ponzi scheme of the 1920s in the Jim and Tammy Faye Baker scandal, and in some of the scandals that we've seen since then as well. You mentioned affinity fraud. While you're right that Charles Ponzi wasn't specifically targeting the Christian community, he was targeting the Italian community, because that's the community from which he came.
Right.
And affinity fraud means that you go to people that might be like you in some way, hoping that those people will trust you more than they should. In other words, they will impute trust to you because you belong to the same community, rather than require you to earn their trust. This idea of imputed trust versus earned trust shows up over and over and over again, and that's why religion is such a fertile ground for these kinds of schemes, because we look at somebody that might share our religious beliefs, might go to church on Sunday, we might think that they're upstanding Christian people, fine citizens, or whatever. We will sometimes be seduced into not doing the due diligence that we should do, because after all, God has given us stewardship responsibility over the money that we have. It's all God's money, but we have stewardship responsibilities, and we should take that stewardship responsibility seriously. But sometimes in the religious world, we let our guard down, and people like Jim and Tammy Faye Baker took advantage of that. Specifically, what Jim and Tammy Faye did was that they built this large resort facility near where I live in Charlotte, North Carolina. It was called Heritage USA, and they sold what was essentially timeshares to the Heritage USA. In other words, for $1,000 or so, Kirby or Warren could buy a week, and we could go down to Heritage USA, and we could stay in this Christian environment, stay in this beautiful hotel in this Christian environment for a week for our $1,000. That's not a terrible idea in and of itself. Timeshares are kind of based on that idea. The problem is that, you take 52 weeks in the year and the number of rooms that are in that hotel, and that should be the limit of the number of memberships or partnerships that you sell. But unfortunately, what Jim and Tammy did was that they vastly oversold the number of available rooms and weeks. That is really what Jim Baker ended up going to jail for, was that he fraudulently oversold using the mail and the airwaves to do that. So he was specifically convicted of wire fraud and mail fraud. That's what landed him in jail. In the midst of all of that, though, tons of money was coming in, literally tens of millions of dollars in total, close to $150 million before it was all said and done. And he lived a lavish lifestyle, drove, Rolls Royces, famously had an air-conditioned dog house for Tammy Faye's dog.
Yes.
So, just all the kind of crazy flamboyant stuff that we saw in Charles Ponzi ended up showing up in Jim and Tammy Faye as well.
Let's take a break, and when we come back, we might even get into some of that, because you even have a list of the kinds of airplanes some of the televangelists today have. So what would Jesus fly, I think, was very good. But also we look at a couple of the other issues there as well. We've had some pastors that have certainly been in the news. Mark Driscoll probably is one. We've also done a program in the past about Willow Creek. So we'll get into a couple of those. But most importantly, just talk about how we can be wise investors and wise contributors, and to really understand some of the things to be looking for. And so I wanted you to know about this book, Faith-Based Fraud, Learning from the Great Religious Scandals of Our Time. And we will continue with Warren Cole Smith right after this.
You can make a difference. Yes, we face big tech censorship, government overreach, biblical illiteracy, and many other ills. And while there's no single action to overcome them, no real-life Captain America to come to our rescue, it's a fact that everyday Americans like you are the key to turning things around. The biggest thing you have is that you care, and all you need is the encouragement and the will to stand up for what's right. Your gift of Point of View enables us to reach more people with the information and free resources they need to join you in making a real difference in our homes, at work, in our churches, and our communities. Some of our friends have put $55,000 on the table as a matching challenge. You give, they will match it. Make a difference today by visiting pointofview.net/difference or call 1-800-347-5151. Double your impact today. Make a difference by taking this first step. Pointofview.net/difference and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You're listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kirby Anderson.
Back once again, if you would like to join the conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Warren Cole Smith with us today, talking about the book Faith-Based Fraud. Also have a link to Ministry Watch. It's ministrywatch.com. That is a great place to find out a little bit more about some of these organizations and keep up to date on some of the stories coming down. Of course, we just had the Southern Baptist Convention, and there is some investigation going there about abuse. There are some other organizations and ministries that are listed there, and that is something that we have certainly wanted to consult. There have been times when perhaps my producer Steve will say, how about this organization? I say, well, did you see that article recently in Ministry Watch? I don't necessarily know enough, but I'm a little more hesitant about that. So there's a lot of investigation taking place, and you can find that at ministrywatch.com. And I thought before we get back to the book, Warren, might be good to raise some questions in the minds of a lot of Christians, and that is, we have these scandals, and they have been damaging to reputations. Is it possible these scandals maybe are turning people away from Christianity? So that's one question, but kind of related to that, with some of the flamboyant ministries and some of the excesses, is it also possible that could be used sometime in the future by the government to say, we're just going to end all the tax-exempt organizations because you've misused your funds? And it seems to me that that's why we need watchdogs, to help people understand that there are some concerns, as you would expect. I believe in human sin nature, and I believe that there are going to be those kinds of surfacing issues. But at the same time, if we always say, well, we can't touch God's anointed, or that's just not something we want to talk about, then we also are putting ourselves in danger for the future, aren't we?
Well, we are, and you raised a couple of really great questions. I deal with the questions not only in the book Faith-Based Fraud, but also we deal with them regularly on the Ministry Watch website. I've got a couple of articles that relate to those, those very questions. But let me just very, very briefly, Kirby, take them one at a time. In my view, when we expose these frauds, I can't say for sure whether an individual person. 300 million people in this country. I can't say with certainty how each one of those are going to react. But I do believe that when we expose fraud, that we are contributing to the credibility of the church, not undermining the credibility of the church. Let's face it. The credibility of all of our institutions of public life have gone down dramatically in the last 20 or 30 years. I think one of the reasons that they've gone down is because of our inability to police ourselves. That the world, the secular world, looks at the church and they see these crazy televangelists and others, and I think they are saying to themselves, not, well, boy, look at Benny Hinn. I didn't know that he existed before. Thank you, Ministry Watch, for pointing him out to me. They already knew about Benny Hinn. I think what they're saying is, Warren, Kirby, why are you letting this guy still call himself an evangelical? Why are you still letting this guy be a minister in good standing in the Christian church? Why aren't you calling him out? And I think that is the pressing need of our day. I think that within the, it's not that, if I could put it this way, it's not that pagans are acting like pagans. That's the real problem in our culture today. It's that Christians are acting like pagans. And that, I think that reform begins within the household of faith. And that's really why Ministry Watch exists, to bring transparency and accountability, because we think that will enhance the credibility. And I would also, Kirby, I know I don't need to remind you, but I need to remind myself from time to time that the truth sets us free.
Yes.
The truth always sets us free. The truth never doesn't set us free. So when we tell the truth about what's going on in the church, Yeah, it's difficult, it's tough, it's uncomfortable, but I believe that it is liberating and it is cleansing. And let's face it, even in our own personal individual salvations, it's a good, hard, clear-eyed confrontation of our sin. Confession and repentance are the first steps towards salvation. And I believe that that's true within the body of Christ and at the institutional level as well.
Let's see if we can just dip into one or two other chapters. And one of those is John Bennett and the Foundation for New Era Philanthropy. Because as you point out early on, when you talk about the PTL scandal, or you also have a chapter on Todd Bentley and a number of others, those might have been easier to spot. This one a little bit more difficult, but I think it shows that if you're an accountant like Albert Meyer, or maybe you're a donor, or you're a deacon, or you're an elder, or you're just a church member, and something doesn't seem right, I think we have a responsibility to say, I don't think the numbers add up, or you said this, but I happen to know that the actual reality is just the opposite. And so there is a place for each one of us to ask some tough questions every once in a while, isn't there?
Well, there sure is. And, that's a really great point that you made. You look at someone like Jim and Tammy Baker, and, they're pretty flamboyant. They're kind of out there. And, but John Bennett was not that. He was a quiet guy. He kind of flew under the radar. He was very well connected within the evangelical world. And he came up with this organization, the Foundation for New Era Philanthropy. And this is what he said. He would say, imagine that I'm John Bennett, Kirby, talking to you. I would say, to you, Kirby, what's your favorite Christian ministry? The one that you really give, that you give sacrificially to. Oh, it's ABC ministry. Well, I'll tell you what, you, rather than giving, say, $5,000 to ABC ministry, why don't you give it to me instead? I have an anonymous donor that will match your $5,000. And we'll hold on to your money for 3 months so that we can do some due diligence on this ministry and make sure that everything kind of lines up according to our standards. So again, I'm communicating to you, Kirby, that I'm setting a high bar here, and that I've got this anonymous donor, and that I can double your gift. All of this sounds good to you, and so you give me your $5,000. The problem is that I never have an anonymous donor in the first place.
Yes.
I am using that $5,000 that you gave me for myself. And the only way that I'm eventually able to give this ABC ministry that you love $10,000 is because I've got new donors coming in that I have made exactly the same pitch to. It's a classic Ponzi scheme, as we described in the earlier segment. And there's no investment happening. There's new money is paying for the old. And eventually, like all Ponzi schemes, it falls apart. Now, the difference here is that, again, because John Bennett was well known within the Christian world, and not seen as a flamboyant guy, he really fooled a lot of people. This lasted for years. Again, it ended up involving well over $100 million. It sucked in some of the most sophisticated Christian philanthropists in the country, and involved some of the most well-known Christian ministries in the country as well, including organizations, for example, like Wheaton College.
So again, there's a good example of where people needed to do some due diligence, and apparently there were some individuals. So here's a good example of where you might have access to some information, or the numbers don't seem to add up. And I want as many of our listeners out there to actually be the eyes and ears, because after all, Warren Cole Smith can't do it all, right?
That's exactly right. And you mentioned Albert Meyer in the first segment. He's really the hero of this story, and one of the heroes of the book. He looked at the situation. He had been trained as an accountant. He knew that this just didn't make sense. And I explained in the book, a little bit more about the process, about how he was able to see that it didn't make sense. And he started raising his hand and saying, guys, this doesn't make sense. He ended up getting the Wall Street Journal involved. A reporter named Steve Stecklow ended up writing a series of articles on the Foundation for New Era Philanthropy. One of the key points here is that it really took a heroic, courageous person like Albert Meyer it took the news media, in this case the Wall Street Journal, because the government wasn't looking after the donors and trying to ensure credibility there. The ECFA was not able to intervene in this process to make sure that John Bennett and the Foundation for New Era Philanthropy was held in check. It really took a very few courageous whistleblowers and the media, which is why I think that organizations like yours, Kirby, and like ours, Ministry Watch, are really a vital part of the process, that we perform an important role. And but as you said, the most important role is the individuals who, if something doesn't look right, they should say something. You know, the old saying that you sometimes see on subway systems and airports: if you see something, say something. That should be true of Christians when it comes to their giving as well.
Let's take a break. We'll continue our conversation with Warren Cole Smith right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes. And again, if you'd like to get a copy of the book, we have made it available to you. Of course, you can also go to Ministry Watch as well. Faith-Based Fraud, Warren Cole Smith. And I thought for just a few minutes, we might point out, to be fair, that most ministries don't start out to be fraudulent. But you and I have both been around long enough, I guess I'm even older than you are, to have seen very good organizations that end up in a situation that is very unfortunate. And I, over the years, have interviewed quite a number of people over the last, I guess, 35 years as a host or guest host here on Point of View. And some of the names you mentioned in the book here are ones we've done interviews with. And you also talk about this idea of a Christian industrial complex. So there is a sense in which if a ministry gets really successful and they're in the media, that as a result, there is sometimes a loss of accountability and transparency. And so there are a lot of organizations that I respect and that we've done interviews with that kind of get themselves out in front of their skis, if I can use that illustration for just a minute. And it seems to me that we need to come back to some first principles, and that's why throughout the book, I can't even count the number of times, nor could you, the number of times you use the word transparency and accountability. But those are key, aren't they?
They are key. In fact, I would say that if, Kirby, you don't come away from faith-based fraud with any other, words in your mind, those would be the two words that I would want you to remember. Transparency and accountability are the key. In some ways, it's real simple. It's not always easy to create the structures and the systems of transparency and accountability. But at the end of the day, it really is that simple. And you also made another point just now that I want to reiterate, and that is that the vast majority of Christian ministries in this country are doing great work. The leaders of those ministries are living sacrificial lives. They're not getting rich. They are investing their hearts. They're investing their vocations in loving their neighbors and loving the world. And I just really, want people that are listening to us to know that my intention is not to tear down ministries or the Christian church. We need a Christian ministry ecosystem and a biblically centered church in this culture. We need it now probably more than we've ever needed it. My concern, though, is that a few bad apples will cause the world to think that all of Christian ministries, the entire Christian ministry world, is flawed. And it's something that, again, you mentioned in the last segment that, if we don't clean up our own act, we are going to invite government regulation and oversight. We are going to invite the continued diminishment of the confidence of the public in what we do. So what we're trying to do at Ministry Watch is to prevent those negative outcomes from showing up. Let's clean up our act so that other people don't clean it up for us.
Well, and again, there's some things in the news, even apart from your book, that they might have seen. I know that Senator Charles Grassley, for example, asked for detailed financial information from 6 different ministries, oftentimes called the Grassley Six. You have a whole chapter on that. I did mention about the number of individuals that have jets, and I love that. Just as bird watchers develop a life list of birds they've seen, so plane spotters develop list of planes and celebrity owners they have seen. You've got a list here of about 24, top-of-the-line jets. Again, there are just some questions I think people should ask when you have that level of funding and people aren't necessarily accountable. Another one to maybe pay attention to, we mentioned the ECFA. It's sad to say that sometimes these scandals happen when ECFA, they were members in good standing. But boy, if you see an organization drop out of ECFA, I mean, there might be some reasons. They're no longer doing ministry, or maybe they're broke and can't even afford to do an audit or a compilation, but those are just some warning signs to start looking for. Can you give us some other ideas on how we can be good, intelligent, and wise investors?
Yeah, absolutely. You mentioned a couple of great ones. I mean, if an organization drops out of the ECFA, by the way, we monitor ECFA membership, and if an organization drops out, we will often write an article about that and post it on our website. So you can go to the ministrywatch.com website and just type in ECFA, and you'll see any stories that we've written along those lines. But does the organization release a Form 990 to the public? As I mentioned earlier in the show, Kirby, a lot of Christian ministries are now petitioning the Department of Treasury, the IRS, to be reclassified as a church, even though they don't marry, they don't bury, they don't hold Sunday services, they don't do any of the things that you might think. They don't have local oversight, deacons, elders, that sort of thing. We think that's a bad practice. And so if you are thinking about giving to a Christian organization, or maybe you already are you should ask, can I see your Form 990? By the way, those Form 990s are now on a number of different websites. We post the financial statements of the 1,000 largest Christian ministries in this country at the Ministry Watch website. So and not only that, but we also rate the ministries based on their financial efficiency. So there's a lot of great online resources. So I strongly recommend that your listeners would take advantage of those online resources at ministrywatch.com and elsewhere. Make sure they're releasing a Form 990. Make sure they have an independent board of directors, and you can know that by looking at the Form 990. The names of the board members are there, and if those board members are getting a salary, that means that they're an employee of the organization. They are not independent. They will not provide the kind of oversight that you need. There needs to be at least a majority of board members that are not on the payroll of the organization.
Yes.
And that's another thing that you can learn from the Form 990. So those are a couple of quick things. We could list all day long, but I would say that if you just look at the Form 990, are they members of the ECFA? Are they releasing their audited financial statements to the public? And if you get a no to any one of those three, you should start asking some really tough questions.
I would certainly agree. Let me just mention before we finish here, the book, Faith-Based Fraud. If people write to you at Ministry Watch, maybe want to get multiple copies, because I was thinking, as my wife will tell you, I probably sit on more boards than any individual should be sitting on, but just the kind of thing where you might say, I might want to buy a copy of this book for every board member, or make this available to my pastor or the elders board or the deacons board or something like that, so that we don't go down that same road, because there are some people that started with a desire to defraud individuals, and we talked about Ponzi and Bennett, but you can see other ministries that you talk about in this book that were doing good work, but they just got a little too famous, got a little too much money, and if we want to prevent other churches and Christian organizations from making the same mistakes, I would encourage them to get a copy of the book, and they can do that by contacting you at ministrywatch.com, can't they?
Yeah, that's exactly right. My email address is real simple. My name is Warren Smith, just wsmith@ministrywatch.com. I'd love to hear from you individually. I try to answer all my emails. Wild Blue Press out of Denver, Colorado is a publisher. They've got individual and bulk sales available there. Of course, you can contact me and we could try to work something out as well. But yeah, we would love for all Christian ministry leaders and donors to have a copy of Faith-Based Fraud. Again, the point is not just to tell these stories or to tear down these ministries or to point a finger at them, but to say, what can we learn from them? What can we do to make sure that the organizations that we love and we care about and we know is doing the Lord's work continues to operate in faithful ways for months, years, even decades into the future if the Lord tarries?
Well, again, we appreciate you, Warren Cole Smith, and look forward to the next opportunity. Of course, co-author of so many other books that we've talked about in terms of restoring all things, as well as Prodigal Press, and of course, the author of this book, A Faith-Based Fraud. So let's take a break. When we come back, let me open up the phones, 1-800-351-1212. I'm going to get into some aspects of critical race theory, what's been happening in the schools. We'll get into some other issues in the news. Of course, we have the president overseas right now talking with various leaders, including Vladimir Putin. So we have a lot to cover, and we will do so. But if you'd like to join us at any point, 1-800-351-1212. All the information we're talking about is on the website, pointofview.net, and we'll be back right after this.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/sign-up. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints commentary at pointofview.net/signup. Pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kirby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kirby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kirby Anderson.
This hour we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about this subject that is in the news all the time, seemingly, critical race theory. If this time last year I talked about it, I think a lot of people say, I don't know what you're talking about, and I really don't care. Even in the fall, when we started talking a little bit more about how to respond to it, I think a lot of people said, well, I'm glad you're talking about it, but it's just not an issue. But it has become kind of almost front page news. And even though I write my commentaries a week ahead of time and record them a week ahead of time, it turns out that yesterday's commentary dealt with the subject of critical race theory, and I was in particular using that commentary yesterday to talk about the fact that even people that wouldn't be considered conservatives, even people that wouldn't necessarily call themselves Christians, at least maybe in the most broad sense, are still recognizing the dangers of what has become known as race theory. Critical theory really developed. I'll get into that in just a minute. But then the whole idea of critical race theory has, in some respects, not only challenged the whole culture, but even the, if you will, the bedrock of foundational Western civilization. And that was my piece yesterday with Andrew Sullivan, in which he talks about removing the bedrock of liberalism and says, you know, if you actually even hold to basically liberal ideas, and by that liberal ideas would be free speech, freedom of assembly, legal equality, constitutional neutrality, rationality, free speech, open-ended discussion, as well as an honest appraisal of history, then you're going to find yourself at odds with what is being taught in the universities called critical race theory. Well, that being said, those ideas don't stay just on the college campus. They've been there for some time, but they show up as well in high schools. And so we're going to spend a little bit of time today, as you will look at some of the articles I've posted, talking about what is happening on the college campus, what is happening in the schools, what is happening at many of these school board meetings now, and how we can respond to it. And that all kind of sets up for my commentary today, which we'll get into in more detail later on, because once you've had a number of concerned parents, and many of them are conservative, but not exclusively. Many of them are Christian, but some of them are very secular, progressive types, but still upset about what's being taught at the schools. They show up on the school boards, and so now you've had a pushback from people that are promoting this idea of critical race theory, of saying, well, these people don't know what they're talking about. It's just the latest Christian right boogeyman, although a lot of the criticism is not coming from the Christian right, although some is, of course, or they don't know what it is, or they just don't understand it's just a very important theory that we can use to evaluate. And so there's an attempt to just kind of dismiss all of that, and that's one of the articles we'll get to in just a few minutes. But my commentary today, I call it Critics of Critical Race Theory, because Tom Gilson actually points out that, let's use the state of Texas for a moment, quotes from a Texas State Board of Education member who writes that critics have no idea what critical race theory is. They've never read a book, much less a paragraph on it. Of course, Tom says, oh, yes, I have. Matter of fact, Tom Gilson's been on the program with us a number of times. And then he quotes from another article that came out in which they said critics are really against this because they don't want to talk about race, racism, racial disparities. No, I do, but the point is, he says, the article talks about we need to have a talk, or we need to be talking about racial issues. He says they talk about it 8 times, but then gives us a very important quote from one of the kind of the standard books on critical race theory. It's entitled Understanding Critical Race Theory. It's written about 4 years ago. It's hardly controversial. I mean, some of the books coming out now are a lot more controversial. We'll get to those in just a minute. But it's the one where it talks about the fact that critical race theory, this is a direct quote, critical race theory questions the very foundations of the liberal order, including equality theory, legal reasoning, Enlightenment rationalism, and the neutral principles of constitutional law, which is a good illustration of why even Andrew Sullivan, who would probably refer to himself more as kind of a libertarian type, said, well, there's a lot more at stake here than you might have imagined. And so let's, if we can, get to some of the articles that I've posted here today, and we'll work our way through that. If you'd like to ask a question, feel free to do so. And before we end here, I'm not ignoring the fact that we've had the G7 leaders gathering together. And you have, of course, today the meeting between our president, Joe Biden, as well as Russia's president or leader, dictator, whatever you want to say, Vladimir Putin. And there'll be probably some other things that we'll be talking about even as this week unfolds, and certainly we'll get into it in more detail on Friday. But my first piece is Tom Hanks and critical race theory. Matter of fact, Charles Cook actually calls it, "This is your brain on critical race theory." And it illustrates a point I want to make before we take the break. If you've listened to me any length of time, you've heard me say sometimes you can never be woke enough. And Tom Hanks found that out the hard way, because he actually wrote a piece for the New York Times about the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre, which is really one of the saddest chapters in American history, and points out that he'd never read about this in his high school history book, about how a mob of white people burned down a place which at that time was called the Black Wall Street. And he argues that history was mostly written by white people about white people like me, while the history of black people, including the horrors of Tulsa, was too often left out. So, once again, appreciate the fact that he's illustrating that this is also part of American history, a sad part of American history. The other day, even President Biden talked about it a little bit. You would think he would be getting accolades for that. And you would be wrong, because writing for the National Public Radio, Eric Duggins explained that what he had written in the New York Times was not enough. In other words, he says Tom Hanks is a non-racist, but it's time for him to be an anti-racist. And if you don't understand that term, you need to go and learn a little bit more about Ibram X. Kendi, because he is arguing that we have to not just be not racist, we have to be anti-racist. And what he says, that is Eric Duggins says, is while Hank's words were nice, they did not change the fact that he has built a sizable part of his career on stories about American white men doing the right thing. Of course, doing, the right stuff and all sorts of stuff. If he really wants to make a difference, Hanks and other stars need to start specifically thinking about how their work has contributed to these problems and how they must change. And so the argument is sort of that he was writing about these white heroes, and the reason he was is because they were, heroes. Call me simple here, but when you write about the heroes of, D-Day, you write about the heroes in the Apollo program, or maybe even the Alabama hijacking, or some of the other adventures, you're talking about heroes. And yet just doing that enough is not enough, and you cannot be woke enough. And J.K. Rowling of Harry Potter fame, Tom Hanks, so many of them, even trying to be woke, are not woke enough. And so when we come back from the break, I'm going to talk a little bit more about the criticism that Tom Hanks is now receiving, because, as I said, you can never be woke enough. We'll be back right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kirby Anderson.
Yesterday, I talked about how even some liberal commentators are very concerned about the arguments for critical race theory. But it turns out that if you're a critic of critical race theory, you will be labeled as ignorant and racist. Tom Gilson addresses those changes in a recent commentary. He quotes from a Texas school board education member who writes that critics have no idea what critical race theory is, what it does, or who the founders are. They've never read a book, much less a paragraph on it. From there, she goes on to use language I won't use on radio or in this commentary. He also quotes from another article that argued that critics don't want to talk about racial disparities because they want to normalize the behavior and allow current patterns of behavior to continue. Tom Gilson says the words talk or talking show up 8 times in the article, but critical race theory isn't about just talking about racial disparities. He quotes from a standard source written 4 years ago and hardly the most controversial book on the subject. That book provides the quote I mentioned yesterday. It explains that critical race theory questions the very foundations of the liberal order, including equality theory, legal reasoning, Enlightenment rationalism, and neutral principles of constitutional law. The book also argues that radical measures are in order because society is so racist. When it was written, the authors may not have meant radical involved riots, protests, and burning cities, but we have seen the natural result of arguing that America is systemically racist, full of white privilege, and in need of a social revolution to overturn the existing order. I agree with Tom Gilson. He concludes that the critics of critical race theory oppose it not from ignorance, but because they truly understand its dangers. I'm Kirby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you hear on Viewpoints by visiting pointofview.net. Pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, if you'd like to join the conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Just quoting from the first article we've posted here by Charles Cook. And again, the theme that sort of runs through this article, and we'll run through some of the others we're going to talk about in just a minute, because we're going to get into the whole issue of what is happening right now in the schools. We have, I think, a number of very controversial meetings that are being held by school boards across the country. I've said before, one of the most important elections you can be involved with is school board, because after all, it's going to determine what your children and grandchildren actually hear in the classroom. Even if you have decided, and I think wisely, I hope, decided not to have your kids in the government schools, you still are paying for it with your tax dollars, and your kids are going to have to grow up with the kids in those public schools. And so you can never be woke enough, and this starts out really talking about Tom Hanks, but almost immediately, then Charles Cook reminds us that it relates exactly to what we'll be talking about the rest of this hour, and that is what's happening in the schools. Because he points out that invariably people that begin to actually question what's called critical race theory or modern anti-racism are oftentimes told that they're in no position to actually oppose its adoption in American schools. But no such confusion can be alleged in this case because, as Charles Cook points out, we talked about Ibram X. Kendi actually was asked this week in Slate to explain critical race theory. Because you're hearing all sorts of people saying, oh, they don't know what they're talking about. Okay, well, here's one of the proponents explaining it, and his explanation is basically exactly the criticism that was lodged against Tom Hanks by Eric Duggins in National Public Radio. Matter of fact, uses the same criteria: racist, non-racist, anti-racist. Now, here, I think, illustrates something we talked about months ago with Doug Groteis. If you accept the premise of critical race theory, if you accept the premise of this idea of anti-racism, white supremacy, white fragility, all the issues associated with that, it's a no-win situation. Because, Charles Cook points out, had Tom Hanks elected to stay quiet, he would have been deemed guilty of inadvertently endorsing the unequal status quo. Had he rejected Dugan's premise entirely, he'd been deemed guilty of explicitly endorsing the unequal status quo. And having chosen to speak up in a way that tracked neatly with what he was told was expected of him, he was still deemed guilty of inadequately fighting the unequal status quo. Even if he were to follow Dugan's advice to the letter, he would still be deemed guilty of something, and that is the case. Because the argument that is made for poor Tom Hanks is that even though he is liberal, progressive, and has been a harsh critic of Donald Trump and a big supporter of Joe Biden and everything, nevertheless, the criticism is that he's a white man. And Dugans complains that he's been promoting stories about heroes of D-Day and the Apollo program and the hijacking of the freighter and all sorts of adventures because he's guilty of spending a career, quote, amplifying the ideas of white American exceptionalism and heroism. But again, to be fair to Tom Hanks, the people he's doing films about and acting in really were heroes. Now, lest you think that Tom Hanks has not done enough, one of the other producers who is being criticized is Steven Spielberg. Now, think about this one, because Steven Spielberg has done some that have amplified those who were African Americans. Color Purple comes to mind. Amistad comes to mind. And so you can begin to see that there is a sense in which once you sort of head down this woke theology, it's almost impossible to actually get a point where people say thank you, because you can just never be woke enough. Anyway, let's get to our second article here, and that's Michael Brennan Doherty, The Revolt Against Left-Wing Schooling. And I brought this together because I've got this one, I've got one by Robert Knight and a couple of others that have all sort of surfaced within the last couple of days, and so I thought it would be appropriate to put all these together, because he points out that in the past few months, he says, we've seen teachers resigning their positions with fiery letters denouncing the tribalism and sectarianism that is overtaking traditional liberal education. And you can see this in some of these YouTube videos that have been posted where you've had parents or sometimes teachers being very critical of school boards or of administrations. And he says the fact that these debates involve children almost guarantees that they will be the subject of moral panic and hysteria. And we should say that in these curriculum debates, there is a great deal of deception. We're hiding the ball, talking past each other, often deliberately. A school district might propose an anti-racist pedagogy, and parents and critics will respond they don't want critical race theory taught in the school. The district's defender will reply, well, we're not teaching a graduate seminar on the thoughts of Professor Derek Bell. And parents will complain that teachers are smuggling in trendy concepts about white fragility and whiteness. And the teachers will file back, no. These parents don't want us to teach that slavery was racist. And finally, and most unhelpful, someone will pipe up saying, who really remembers what they taught you in the 10th grade anyway? I love the way he writes this. And of course, then he points out a couple of issues as well, because there's some other reasons why this has become so thermonuclear. He says, first, Precisely like police reform, it involves a public sector union that certain members of the community feel is staffed and run by fundamentally hostile people who cannot be trusted to carry out their mission, even if given new and tough strictures and training. He says, second, beyond the material actually is the textbooks or videos. Our new educational debate is fundamentally about alliances in a time of dissension and polarization. Education of children involves putting things in children's heads. The memorization of names, facts, definitions, the learning of stories, fables, and myths. Education involves imparting certain mental skills, the use of rhetoric, the ability to decode a text, the ability to confront new, complex, and unsettling ideas with some confidence. But fundamentally, it involves the passions. We educate the heart. We teach it what to love, honor, cherish, and aspire. This is the motive power for all the rest. And so at the very end, he points out that in some respects, we've broken the truce. And what is that? Well, the truce was kind of what he calls the uneasy but mostly accepted way of teaching American history at the secondary level, was to reconcile the above impulses by teaching an alliance to the historic American nation and its institutions, precisely because that nation and its institutions embodied or enabled the pursuit of a more perfect and just union and the spread of democratic values. He says, in some respects, American high school education took from Martin Luther King Jr. the notion of our founding its documents as a promissory notes. This truce, if it was noticed at all, tended to be critiqued only by certain conservatives. And you might remember that the famous speech by Martin Luther King was, when the nation was founded, yes, we did have slavery. When the nation was founded, yes, we did have gross inequity. When the nation was put together and the Constitution was written, not everybody was free, for sure. Even when the Declaration of Independence was written, that all men are, endowed by their Creator, you have recognized this being written itself by at least one of those individuals drafting that, a slave owner. But it was, as Martin Luther King used to say, and probably said most eloquently in his famous speech, it was a promissory note. It was the idea that we have not achieved this, but we have a desire in each generation to do better. And so eventually we get rid of slavery. Eventually we get rid of Jim Crow. Eventually we get rid of certain kinds of things that prevent individuals in a particular ethnic background, class, whatever, from having achievement. And we would certainly want to talk about those dark chapters of American history. And I've done whole weeks of programs, which you can read on the American Indian and Indian Wars, on slavery and some other aspects of racism. I have a chapter in my book, Christian Ethics in Plain Language, on the issue of race and racism. But at the same time, to start with the assumption that this has always been a racist nation, to imbibe some of the ideas in the 1619 Project go far beyond. So this is why you're seeing such a conflict in the school boards. When we come back from the break, I'll take some phone calls, but also want to read this very good piece by Robert Knight that came out on Monday, stopping some of these ideas one school district at a time. We'll talk about that with him and you right after these messages.
You can make a difference. Yes, we face big tech censorship, government overreach, biblical illiteracy, and many other ills. And while there's no single action to overcome them, no real-life Captain America to come to our rescue, it's a fact that everyday Americans, like you, are the key to turning things around. The biggest thing you have is that you care, and all you need is the encouragement and the will to stand up for what's right. Your gift of Point of View enables us to reach more people with the information and free resources they need to join you in making a real difference in our homes, at work, in our churches, and our communities. Some of our friends have put $55,000 on the table as a matching challenge. You give, they will match it. Make a difference today by visiting pointofview.net/difference or call 1-800-347-5151. Double your impact today. Make a difference by taking this first step. Pointofview.net/difference and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kirby Anderson.
Back once again, trying to give you a little bit of a perspective on why some of these school board meetings have been so contentious and why I think they're going to be contentious in the future. Now, one of the questions asked off the air is, can you kind of at least give us a background on what critical race theory is? Now, we've done this before, and there are a lot of articles, including my commentary yesterday and my commentary today. And it's interesting because my commentary yesterday, where I'm quoting from a very intellectual individual who obviously has used to reading a lot of philosophical material, nevertheless, I thought was interesting, points out that he was really kind of overwhelmed, I guess is the best way to say it, by what he called the sheer volume of jargon words, because he thinks some of this is an attempt, as he said, to sow confusion. So, as you might imagine, I'm going to do a booklet on the subject of critical race theory. Probably should have done it months ago. I'm working on it right now. Part of it is now it's become so more contentious, I want to make sure that we give it an accurate definition, because that's part of the problem. As soon as you define what it is, somebody says, oh, that's not what it is, because this is a game that's being played to say you don't really understand what it is. And so you have to read some of the books and all the rest. But why is it called critical race theory? First of all, it's part of what is called critical theory that was developed by the Frankfurt School. Now, critical doesn't mean critical thinking. That's a good thing. No, critical means critique, and that is there was a school of thought in the Frankfurt School in Germany, bringing that over to the United States, primarily Columbia University, but not exclusively, began to evaluate things very differently. And critical theory instead said, we're going to look at the inequalities that exist. Now, classical Marxism said the inequalities are due to class. You have the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. And you have the workers, and they're going to eventually revolt against the factory workers because it's unequal. And so this inequality was due to class. Well, we've never had much of a class structure in America. We've had some, but not a lot. And frankly, you've just never had the Marxist revolution where the workers at the factory decide to overthrow the owners of the factory. And so this was an attempt to start looking at critical theory, looking instead on class, but on race, maybe gender, sexual orientation. And in particular, classical race theory just simply says there's an inequality due to race. And so this is kind of oftentimes referred to as cultural Marxism. And so then there have been all sorts of more recent books that have said, yes, we have white fragility, we need to be anti-racist, and in some respects it almost, in trying to, quote, fight racism, becomes racist. And a good example of that gets to my third article. Robert Knight's been on the program with us many times before. This was the article appeared on Monday in the Washington Times. And he points out that this one county in Virginia, which is a fairly conservative county near Washington, D.C., is one that mostly has been conservative, but because you've had so many people moving in, the population has more than doubled from about 170,000 in 2000 to 430,000. And a lot of those that have come in there have brought with it some of their more radical ideas, and that's become part of what's called the blue tide. You can read the whole details, but I'm giving you a quick summary of it. And so that has led to a desire to implement some of these more liberal, progressive, dare I even say, sort of culturally Marxist ideas in the classroom. And so that has surfaced in one of these school board meetings. And frankly, if you go out right now, say on YouTube, and you type in, Loudoun County, Virginia, or you type in critical race theory school board or something like that, you're going to see some of these very interesting and controversial and very contentious meetings, because in some respects this particular county has sort of become, as he says, ground zero and a parent's pushback that is taking shape around the nation. So he just uses what's happening there in Virginia to illustrate what's happening. Matter of fact, I've got another example out of Kentucky here that I may get to before the end of the hour. We'll just see how this goes. And it's been an attempt to try to expose some of the things being taught in the classroom And part of that has to do with the fact that people have been able to get a hold of the curriculum. And as I mentioned a couple of weeks ago on a Friday program, we went through this in some detail on how successfully conservative parents in a school district just a little bit to the west of where I'm broadcasting today were able to elect different members to the school board and pretty much end that. And so this is something that's unfolding in Virginia. It's unfolding really probably in a school district near you as well. And I thought it was interesting because Robert Knight points out that one mother who's a refugee from communist China, Ji Van Fleet, actually was telling the school board that this looks a lot like the country she left. She said to me and a lot of Chinese, it is heartbreaking that we escaped communism and now we experience communism here. The communist regime, she said, used the same critical theory to divide people. The only difference is they use class instead of race. Because your classic Marxism would really be pretty much talking about dividing people on the basis of class. Cultural Marxism divides people on the basis of race. And if you're on the wrong race, well, then you're an oppressor. Doesn't matter whether you actually have oppressed anybody, but you are listed as an oppressor. And if you are of the right race, then you're a victim. Even if you're a very well-heeled individual, maybe even an NBA star, even a famous broadcaster, simply on the basis of race, you are given either the status of oppressor or victim. Well, this led to a series of other issues because it's not just race. Sometimes it's gender as well. And some of the outrage came from this elementary gym teacher, Tanner Cross, who actually refused to address the children by their chosen identity pronouns. Instead, he actually said, look, I love my students, but I will never lie to them regardless of the consequences. He says, I'm a teacher, but I serve God first, and I not will affirm that a biological boy can be a girl and vice versa. It's lying to the child. It's abuse to a child, and it's sinning against God. And so that was another issue that surfaced in that school board meeting. So you can see that oftentimes critical theory isn't necessarily always critical race theory. It can be critical gender theory or sexual orientation theory. And so I've posted this particular article by Robert Knight to help you see that what is kind of happening right now in Virginia as ground zero is happening around the nation. And that's one of the benefits I would have to say about point of view, because sometimes you think this is only happening in my community. No, it's not. Well, just before we take a break, let me take one more issue, and that is, if you read my commentary today, I point out how those individuals that are promoting this idea of race theory, and they may not even know that they're promoting critical race theory, how in many cases they respond to that. And that is this particular piece, it's next, my last piece that we've posted here, is one in which it points out that you've had all sorts of editorials being written against the so-called Christian right. And one of those I read the other day. I thought about bringing it up, but now since it's in this particular article by Gabe Kaminsky by Charles Blow, he argues, that is Charles Blow in the New York Times, that what this is the latest boogeyman of the so-called Christian right, and the same boogeyman of conservatives, because the argument he first makes is that critical race theory is not actually a threat. He says it's merely an idea publicized by Republicans who hate minorities, not because they're allowed to have dissenting opinions about curriculum. So he says the rush by states across the country to ban the teaching of critical race theory in schools isn't really about a real threat. He says very few schools even teach critical race theory. Wrong. As a core part of their curriculum, Republicans are using this tried and true playbook of fear-mongering about the rise of otherness and the displacement of whiteness, the white patriarchy, and the dominant white narrative. So the first thing is it's not a threat. Well, then, of course, he goes and uses the other argument I just mentioned a minute ago. They don't even understand. In fact, they don't even believe that most people have any real concept of what critical race theory is. It's just a collection of words that hint to them an agitation and an aggrievement, a theory that mentions race, and that is critical or in the mind criticizes. And so, again, you can see that the game is being played right now. It's just a theory. It's not about race. You don't really know what it's all about. And if you're against it, that means you want to promote racism. Those are not good arguments, but those are the arguments you're going to hear. And when we come back, just to maybe give you another look, I did not post this one, but there is the same kind of battle being fought right now in Kentucky. And I just wanted you to see that this is breaking out all over the country. And if you're going to be a responsible citizen, once you know you're not the only one, and we can learn some lessons on how to address these issues at your next school board meeting. We'll be right back.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
And for a few more minutes, let me just mention as a program note that tomorrow in studio will be Dr. Erwin Lutzer. We Will Not Be Silent is his latest book. We'll talk about that and just how we can respond to some of these things that are happening around the country, especially a lot of these school boards. So we'll talk about that with him. Stephen Miller in the second hour. And then don't forget our Friday weekend edition will be Penna Dexter and Dr. Merrill Matthews. So lots of things to cover. And lest you think that critical race theory is the only thing being discussed at school boards. Let me quote from some of the material by our good friend Gary Bauer, because the school board in Randolph, New Jersey, just voted to drop the names of all of the holidays from the school calendar. We don't want to offend anybody by having Thanksgiving or Christmas, so the calendar will now just simply say day off. So happy day off or merry day off or whatever. Gary said he watched the video of the school board meeting. I just can't bring myself to some of the contentions of that. But the motion was made to eliminate the names of the holidays. The people in the audience were just shocked. People yelling objections and everything. And the whole idea is the elites were basically telling the taxpayers, I know your property taxes pay for all this, but you can't keep your holidays. And so what's happened? Well, thousands of people have signed a petition calling for the members of the Randolph School Board to resign. So not every contentious school board meeting right now is about critical race theory, but most are. Let me go back to this. In Loudoun County, Virginia, he points out that there's 9 school board members and 6 of them are facing recall efforts. That's pretty contentious. How about Fairfax County, Virginia? That's the county I lived in when I went to Georgetown. Parents are opposed to critical race theory, and they've just taken over the leadership of the Parent-Teacher-Student Association of the Thomas Jefferson High School for Science and Technology, one of the top-rated public high schools, and the list goes on and on. So if you think we're going to have some contentious school board meetings, yes, we are. Is it time for some of you to pay attention to who's running for school board? Yes. Maybe it may be time for some of you to run for school board, but just as we wind down here, let me just give you one other story. This is a very lengthy one in National Review. Ryan Mills talked about how teachers see progress, conservative parents see racism. The battle for public education arrives in America. He says news that a new social equity course was being planned in Highlands High School in Fort Thomas, Kentucky, started surfacing. And once again, here's the principal issue to pay attention to. Once the proposed syllabus was leaked online, students who signed up for the elective course would then have to develop awareness, engage in constructive discussion about social justice and diversity issues. They'd learn about the intersectionality of gender, race, class, sexuality, and they had to then create an action plan for future social change. As you looked at what this was, you had all sorts of guest speakers lined up, and they were all going to be teaching different aspects of what we would call critical race theory. They were supposed to watch Dave Chappelle, which, first of all, I think should have been nixed for no other reason than the number of swear words in the video. The required textbooks were Ibram X. Kendi, How to Be an Anti-Racist. I just mentioned his name a minute ago. And Robin DiAngelo's White Fragility. I mentioned that one as well. And I appreciate Ryan Mills because he helps point this out, because he said to opponents of the course, it was apparent this was an attempt to inject critical race theory into the school, even if the syllabus doesn't specifically mention it. One mom said, anyone who believes this particular course is not critical race theory doesn't understand what critical race theory is. Now, to the supporters of the course, the opponents were, quote, flaunting their white privilege, trying to whitewash American history. And one of the individuals saying, many critics want to shroud themselves in a European fairy tale that downplays the role of slavery and racism in our country's foundation. Some of the critical statements being made there should tell you quite enough about what's going on there. And as I mentioned, you think about what's going on here. The particular video by Dave Chappelle used curse words, and I won't use them, obviously, but these curse words start with F, starts with N, those kinds of things. Actually criticizes some of the people we've actually had on this program, like Candace Owens. She's called a rotten, well, that's a B word, so I won't mention that one. Makes some comments about Laura Ingraham. I can't even say those words because they all would be swear words, and that's what the kids would be actually watching on the video. What about the books? Well, the books by Kendi, for example, How to Be an Anti-Racist, is focusing on race-based discrimination in order to achieve equity. And we've talked about on this program before, equity is not the same thing as equality. It's the only remedy to past discrimination is present discrimination. The only remedy for present discrimination is future discrimination. So we want to discriminate in order to prevent discrimination, if you can follow that logic, and there's really nothing there. And then you have White Fragility by D'Angelo, which actually writes that white people raised in Western society are conditioned into a white supremacist worldview because it's the bedrock of our society and its institutions. And he suggests that white people should be viewed as a racist collective socialized into fundamentally hating black people. And so you can kind of get a sense of where all this takes you. But if nothing else, I wanted you to spend a little bit of time with us today talking about how this issue of critical race theory has really kind of reached a boiling point. And it's quite likely that many of these contentious school board meetings are going to continue. And it's maybe time for you to think about doing a little bit of research, making your voice known, and in some cases thinking about whether or not to support candidates that want to honestly look at our history, because our history is one where we've had racism, where we've had slavery, but one that does not then condemn individuals as a class of people. So those are some topics certainly we will be coming back to, but this week we will also, especially on Friday, talk about the fact that we've had the G7 leaders on the world stage, and in some respects try to get a sense of what is happening there. It was interesting that the French president actually said to Joe Biden that he's so glad that he's now part of the club and willing to cooperate. And I take that to mean willing to provide the national defense for Europe. Remember when Trump was talking about Europe needed to pay their fair share? Got a feeling they're going to backtrack on that. While at the same time, Europe is making energy deals with Russia and trade deals with communist China. So we'll see where that takes us. And so that is one of the topics we'll address on Friday. And as well, our good friends at First Liberty Institute are actually engaged in an interaction right now with the IRS because it turns out that at least one conservative organization was denied its 501c3 status. And so we'll find out how that actually plays itself out. The president of that organization is Bunny Pounds, who's been on the program, and a good friend with Dr. Merrill Matthews. And it's kind of like, oh, here we go again. You know, for those of you that have been around for a while, remember when the IRS denied 501c status and 501c4 status to various conservative groups. That seems to be happening once again, no surprise, under the Biden administration. So lots of things to cover, but don't forget tomorrow we're going to have Dr. Erwin Lutzer in studio. We look forward to that opportunity to chat with him. If you find yourself saying, I'd like to know a little bit more about some of the material that we covered in the first hour with Warren Cole Smith, or I'd like to read some of the articles that you have posted dealing with critical race theory, it is all at our website, pointofview.net. Most importantly, I hope you'll click on that banner, be a difference maker, and support this ministry. I want to thank Andrew and Ivy for their help behind the scenes. We look forward to seeing you tomorrow right here on Point of View.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/sign-up. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/sign-up. pointofview.net/signup. Point of View